Welcome from the board and staff of Wild Connections. My name is Kristen Skog, and I'll be your host tonight for our look back in history at the pioneering ascents of Pikes Peak, which is also known as America's Mountain. We thank you for your participation tonight. Allison Galinsky is handling the technical aspects of the presentation behind the scenes. Wild Connections has been defending biodiversity and roadless areas in central Colorado. We work to provide refuge for native species as the climate changes. We influence decision-making about public lands, bringing protection to hundreds of thousands of acres. We connect citizens to those lands through educational hikes and events like this one, restoration projects, and political action. Our volunteers improve habitat and close illegal motorized routes so that wildlife can thrive in quiet, reconnected places. Wild Connections is proud to sponsor this presentation by our own John Stansfield. And now a little bit about John. For 40 years, storyteller and author John Stansfield has recounted tales from the American West and the world. He reenacts the lives of Colorado pioneers, including Enos Mills, who was the driving force behind the creation of Rocky Mountain National Park, John Otto, the first park custodian of the Colorado National Monument, and Charles Fox Gardner, Colorado frontier physician. John served as an artist in residence in Rocky Mountain National Park in 2014. John is a founding member of Wild Connections, who's made extensive contributions to conservation causes in our state. John has shared stories with more than 1 million people nationwide, thankfully not all at once, and tonight we are privileged to hear one of his stories. Take it away, John.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Kristen, thank you, Allison. For keeping things going. I've got some slides I'm going to be showing throughout, and in just a moment I will share the screen. Allison, if we're ready.
Go ahead, John.
There we go. Come on. Yay. It worked. It's always so wonderful when it works. So at the outset of everything, the key thing in the title of this event is known. And we'll get into that in just a second, and why that's a significant part of the title in determining and in celebrating the first man and the first woman who ascended Pikes Peak. Just one thing I should say at the outset, and I think everybody recognizes this, but just so everybody's clear, that Pikes Peak, even in 1820, especially after Zebulon Pike and his expedition in 1806, Pikes Peak, as it was not called back then by many, that just the high mountain or something, we'll talk about that. It was but very famous nationwide, and even starting to get a reputation around the world. So at any rate, just so that's clear, because I forgot to put that in my notes to say. So here we go. I don't know if this looks familiar to any of you, if you live in Woodland Park or not. This is the Tava bench, an art bench in Woodland Park. And it actually is a recognition. It's an acknowledgement of those who came before us. I have a formal recognition or an acknowledgement I'd like to read, and then we'll get going and start talking about this incredible piece of artwork that you see in front of you. We must acknowledge that the lands on which we live were taken from those who lived here before us. especially the Ute, Pawnee, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people. The Tava bench was set up in 2004. It was built actually in 2003 and 2004. And you may have driven by it before. And if some of you have seen it or stopped even to admire it and to learn from it, that would be great. But thousands of people, at least hundreds of people, every day drive by on US 24 right through the middle of Woodland Park. And that's where this is on the south side, the Pikes Peak side of the road. The meaning of Tava. Tava is actually a shortened version of a Ute word, meaning the mountain of the sun. There it is right there, the mountain of the sun. And Tava is a sacred place, and it's a sacred mountain, a sacred importance to the Utes, especially to, not exclusively definitely, but especially to one of the bands of the Utes, the Tabiwash or the Tabawash Utes. Now, it's special there because, as we said, they don't, as a group, as a as a band, they do not live here, and they do not roam this this area. They are on, most of the people there live on a reservation, not even in Colorado, but in Northwest Utah. The Uinta and Ouray were, excuse me, the Uinta and Ouray reservation. So at any rate, in order to honor their long experience in the Pikes Peak region, as we call it now, 14 years ago, actually as part of a whole series of what we call art benches, the Tavar bench was put in place. And if you could see behind those clouds there in this picture, Pikes Peak sits right there behind it, as you'd expect. Let me zero in on the bench details. And I'll read them for you even now. This is on the back side of the bench. It says, this bench honors these people who consider the mountain, now known as Pikes Peak, to be sacred and integral part of their living legacy. This bench is sited on the ancient Ute Trail and dedicated June 2004. And the plaque in the middle is one for the trail that we'll talk about in a minute. And then this bench over here, this plaque over here, if I can get it to move. There we go. Talks about these symbols. You say, well, that looks like a Jeep or something. And that looks like something I've never seen there on the left. It's surrounded, the bench is surrounded by symbols that are significant in Ute oral history. Symbols, characters in Ute oral history. And then a book of these legends is available at the Woodland Park Library. So if you want to read it, read about it, and perhaps bring your knowledge back over to the bench to see what it's all about, please do. It's a wonderful place to sit for a while and just take some time. Just take some time. And as it says, the last thing there, it says, this bench received a Ute blessing on 6/6/2003. That was when it was not quite finished, but when the blessing was able to be taken. Okay. Now this is a photo from June the 4th. And let me tell you who these people are here, especially the woman without the hat in the middle. This woman, who has since passed on, is a woman named Loya Sespuch. And Loya was a remarkable person. Every year, every summer, for many years, she would round up a number of the Ute young people, from really young, as you can see, and even one of the young women there on the left who has a baby under there, and some of the older children, school-age children. And she would bring them to the Pikes Peak region because there are many places of their legacy, of the Ute legacy, that are here in the Pikes Peak region. And she would take them around and teach them about their heritage. And so, well, who's the one in the straw hat? Well, her name is Celinda Kalin. And Celinda Kalin, some of you may know, she lives in Florissant, and she is a student of the Utes, and is our member adopted into one of the Ute families, Clifford Duncan's family. And she's the one that prepared all the short stories to go along with the symbols on the idols on the bench. Now, this was taken when it had just been put in place in 2003, and you can actually see Pikes Peak, and so you can get some instance of how it relates to Pikes Peak. Now, the guy there, the bearded guy, is a guy named, pardon me, his name was on the back. His name is Sean O'Mealy, and he is the maker of this bench, and he's a wonderful, whimsical, sometimes serious artist in many different media. And so, and these other people here, including my wife, Carol, are others who were involved in the creation of the bench project. So the Beautiful Trail is part of the American Discovery Trail, which goes from coast to coast. And it absorbs basically hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shorter distance trails. And the Beautiful Trail is the one that comes up Ute Pass and goes all the way across to Cripple Creek. So that's the current trail. But I also mentioned to you that the Ute Trail, the ancient Ute Trail, the reason the bench is here, and we're celebrating trails here in 2003, is that the Ute Trail was here for hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And Utes traveled it up and down from the prairie. And also bison traveled it up and down to South Park. And so it was really a significant roadway, you might call it, a way to celebrate. Now, I want to mention one thing. As far as I have discovered, and others who are very knowledgeable, more knowledgeable than I, about Pikes Peak, there has never been a known Native American person, whether named or not named, a Native American person who has climbed to the top of Pikes Peak. Edwin James did, and here's Edwin James. But I want to go through some names first for you to show how times change. Okay, we've talked about the first name that might have been given to the peak. We'll just call it the peak, and that is High Peak, or Highest Peak, perhaps, or Pikes Peak, because Pike was the first. And that name changed from time to time, and we'll get back to that later. Let me just introduce you to Edwin James, one of the important persons in this story. He was 23 years old when he joined on with a long expedition. Now, the long expedition is known as, at least in the report that the final report that Edwin James, 3-volume final report that Edwin James put together, is called the Long Expedition from Pittsburgh to the Rocky Mountains. It started in 1819 with a journey via steamboats for a small group of scientists and people to support the scientists in their discovery. And then also in other steamboats, there were about 1,000 US Army soldiers. And the whole thing really was kind of a flop. They made it as far up the Missouri River where they intended to go, but not very far at all, just as far as the mouth of the Platte River. And that's as far as they got in their first year in 1819. Well, so turns out that in 1819, we had a terrible recession, I suppose, and tax revenues for the federal government and local governments were way down. And so the Army soldiers never made it to the upper Missouri, where they were going to establish an American presence, and the scientists in this small steamboat, well, their orders got changed by their boss, who was the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. So that's why they happened to go not up the Missouri River in the summer of 1820, but up the Platte River and across in front of the mountains that we call the Rocky Mountains. And that's what this is all about. So Edwin James, remarkable young man. He was a man of many skills, as I say. He was the physician. He had studied, he had finished college, but he studied under his brother, who was a physician, for 2 years. So he was qualified as a physician. He was also a wonderful botanist who had studied under some of America's best botanists after he finished college. And he was also a geological student, and again, studied under a fine geologist. And he turned out to be a journalist, keeping his own journal in this case, and a compiler at the end, as I mentioned, what turned out to be 3 huge volumes, reporting about 1819 and 1820s events. Well, of course, the expedition is named after Long. And so this is Stephen Harriman Long. He was a major in the US Corps of Topographical Engineers, of which there were 12 of them in 1819. He was the commander of the expedition. He was the topographer and cartographer, along with the help of a young lieutenant who you will meet. And he led other expeditions for the US government over a number of years, 1819 to 1823. So now let's get going toward Pikes Peak, or whatever you want to call it. Let me give you a real short version of what's been going on. In 1820, going from the place that the steamboat and the men, the scientists and their crew, spent the winter. When summer finally came, and Stephen Long arrived back from a long journey, months journey, traveling to Washington and back to get just some support and some approval for continuing the expedition, the scientific, cultural, and geologic expedition. Remember those 3 things, because those were all the things that were taking place there in terms of the research that was going on. So at any rate, they started on June 6th, and they came up the Platte River, across the prairie, along the river, across the prairie, in hot days, in terrible thunderstorms, across the prairie for exactly 1 month, until they came to the place where the Platte River flows out of the mountains, which we know is southwest of Denver. And although it wasn't there, near today's Chatfield Reservoir. And that's where they were so glad to get. For here were the mountains at last. They finally came up against the mountains, and here was the Platte River. And here were wonderful places, not to begin their scientific studies, but to continue in some really interesting environments their scientific studies. So here they were, and they messed around the mouth, what we call Waterton Canyon, the mouth of Waterton Canyon. They messed around there for a day and a half before Long said, nope, let's go, pack it up, it's time to go. And they headed south. Now they headed south through some of this country that we all know well. You know Red Rocks. you may know Roxborough State Park, and you may know Perry Park, where the golf course is, and the rocks still stand. And here's a picture that the artist, one of the artists, Samuel Seymour, created when he was moving south from the river and up along the base of the mountains, as you can see, very view near the base of the Rocky Mountains, in what we call Perry Park today. They left Perry Park on July 8, and this is how they traveled. I wanted you to see that it was a long line of horses. The horses, and some were pack horses. And here they are heading south through these hills that have no points, that have no peaks or pyramids. These hills that I think, as you can read, I hope you can read on this slide, are the buttes of today's southern Douglas County, what they called the insulated masses of rock. Insulated meaning like insulated, no, not insulated, insulated like insular, like an island, sky islands, that's what they called them. And so here they went on the 8th, and let me see if I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't think so, no, good. So, the next day, the very next day, they headed out and crossed the very low divide between the Platte River at the top of West Plum Creek and came over into the Arkansas River drainage near the head of Monument Creek, what we call Monument Creek today. They had no names, as we know. And they did discover a couple of things. There was a pond at the top of the divide where the water flowed into the Arkansas and the Platte. We call that Palmer Lake today. They found, as they stopped to eat, and Edwin James wandered off to botanize, he found this beautiful flower, which he knew, because he was quite knowledgeable, he knew had not been identified in the United States. And so he was so happy to be able to submit the discrimination, the descriptions of this flower later on, and to have it affirmed by one of his mentors in botany, John Torrey. And if the name Torrey is familiar to you, one of the other 14ers in Colorado is named after John Torrey. So this was the Aquilegia cerealia, the Rocky Mountain columbine. And that's what he found that day. Well, they found something else right on that same spot, very near that same spot. Pardon me. Okay. All right. I'm missing a picture. At any rate, they discovered a rock that to them looked like a huge fallen down castle. And Major Long named it Castle Rock. No, not the Castle Rock you're thinking of, the Castle Rock that we think of today as Elephant Rock. And they went south. They went down Monument Creek, which they called Castle Rock Creek, until they came closer to the mountains, closer to the mountain, to Pikes Peak itself, or what we want to call it itself. You can choose the name you want to put onto it tonight. And they managed to get right to the peak, not as far away, but much closer up against the base of the mountains. And they managed to go right by the top of Pikes Peak, which was out. It was not covered by clouds. They went right by it until their guide, whose name was Joseph Bijou. And if the name of Bijou is familiar to you, well, you've been downtown Colorado Springs. Joseph Bijou said, "No, Commander, we have gone too far. It was that back there where we had lunch." And so they went back and made a camp in view of Pikes Peak. Well, I'm going to leave that one up for right now. That night, when they camped in view of the peak, there was an argument. I don't know how much an argument it was, but it was a serious discussion between Edwin James and Major Long. He was, as I may have implied before, he was always wanting to push on as fast as he could. They had come across the prairie doing 25 miles a day average or more on horseback almost every day, except for the days that they had layoffs, Sundays, time to do some scientific work, but then back on the horses again, and then back they went. Well, it had been part of the orders that came down from Secretary Calhoun that they should explore this peak that Pike had seen but not climbed. And yet Long wanted to keep right on going. And that's what the discussion was about that night. And fortunately for all of us, Edwin James won the discussion, and the next day the orders came down from Major Long that there was to be a 3-day allowance for any scientists who wish to go along to try and climb this peak. And so that's where we go now, and that's where I go to tell you that it's 200 years ago this month, actually on the 13th of this month, that setting out from their camp, which may have been about as far away as this picture here. I'm sorry, I left out the other picture that no, I don't have it. No, I do have it, yes. That Samuel Seymour painted with a big rainstorm that came on the day that they made camp there. And what you could see faintly in the back, the white ghost, is the top of Pikes Peak. So I'm just going to leave this there and go quickly in to revisit Edwin James' narrative of his high country adventure. Edwin James. Oh, whenever I say Edwin James, it's his voice that's coming through. Whenever I maybe make a small pause, you'll be able to tell that it's my voice. Edwin James. At an early hour of the morning on July 13th, Lieutenant Swift, accompanied by the guide, was dispatched from camp to measure a base near the peak and to make there a part of the observations requisite for calculating its elevation. Dr. James, being furnished with 4 men, 2 to be left at the foot of the mountain to take care of the horses, and 2, Zachariah Wilson and Joseph Verplank, to accompany him in the proposed ascent to the summit of the peak. Visiting the beautiful and refreshing fountain, the Boiling Spring, I think you can guess what that is, named today. The party dines on venison and buffalo ribs, hangs some spare provisions in a juniper tree, and takes leave of the 4 left behind and now below. Edwin James. We 3 climbers carried with us each a small blanket, 10 or 12 pounds of bison meat, 3 gills of parched cornmeal, and a small kettle. In ascending, we found the surface in many places covered with this loose and crumbling granite, rolling from under our feet and rendering the ascent extremely difficult. After clambering with extreme fatigue over about 2 miles, we halted at sunset in a small cluster of trees. We could not find a piece of even ground large enough to lay down upon, and were under the necessity of securing ourselves from rolling into the brook by using a pole placed against 2 trees next to which our feet lay. In this situation, we passed an uneasy night. In the morning, we suspended clothing, blankets, and food that could be dispensed with, except about 3 pounds of bison flesh, and continued our ascent, hoping to be able to reach the summit of the peak and return to the same camp in the evening. You'll know this is me. Like the cog railway of later days, James' probable route continues to follow Boiling Springs Creek, today's Ruxton Creek, then heads up the ever-steepening ridge between Ruxton and Lion Creeks to the summit ridge about 2,500 feet below the peak and south of the peak. As they climb, approaching the tree limit, their view across the mountain's face expands greatly. Edwin James, a little above the point where the timber disappears entirely, commences a region of astonishing beauty and of great interest on account of its productions, its vegetative productions. The intervals of soil are sometimes extensive and are covered by a carpet of low but brilliantly flowering alpine plants, penstemons, and the smaller mountain columbine, both radiant in blue. We were under the disagreeable necessity, however, of passing by numbers of other flowers, unexamined. Exhausted at about 2 o'clock, James and Verplanck stopped to rest, eat, and wait for Wilson, who was dragging behind. At that spot, James heard eek, shrill squeaks, and observes a small rock-dwelling animal that he compares to a prairie dog or a ground squirrel. Did you see that thing go across this? Anyway, question, do you know what animal that is? You can't answer, so I'll give you the answer. It was a pika. Even knowing that they will not reach their camp by nightfall, James and Verplanck cannot persuade themselves to turn back, whatever the consequences. And so, with no sign of Wilson, they head upward. Edwin James. On our way, we had attempted to cross a large field of snow, which occupied a deep ravine extending down half a mile from the top. This we found impassable, being covered with a thin ice, not sufficiently strong to bear the weight of a man. It was about 4 o'clock p.m. when we arrived on the summit. The weather was calm and clear, 42 degrees Fahrenheit. We had not been long when we were rejoined by Wilson. This is a note from me. Other than unknown Native American climbers, as we've already discussed, theirs is the first, these 3 men, theirs is the first known climb of Pikes Peak. From the summit of the peak, Edwin James, from the summit of the peak, the views toward northwest and southwest is diversified with innumerable mountains, all white with snow. Immediately under our feet on the west lay the narrow valley of the Arkansas, which we could trace running towards the northwest, probably more than 60 miles. On the north side of the peak was an immense mass of snow and ice. The ravine in which it lay terminated in a woodless and apparently fertile valley. Extending far toward the north, this valley most undoubtedly contains a considerable branch of the Platte. Given Major Long's, this is my note, given Major Long's foregoing exploration of the Platte and Arkansas headwaters, James knew that these observations would be vital. To the south, James noted another summit, probably that ascended by Captain Pike in 1806, at a distance of about 8 or 10 miles. Though staying only about an hour, James made more perceptive observations than the ones simply in the cardinal directions. He discovered permafrost under stones scattered over the summit, examined the rock types there, inspected animal tracks left by bighorn, and in James' words, We were surprised to observe the air in every direction filled with such clouds of grasshoppers as partially to obscure the day. They extended upward from the summit of the mountain to the utmost limit of vision, and as the sun shone brightly, they could be seen by the glittering of their wings at a very considerable distance. So you might ask, what were those insects and what were they doing at 14,000 feet? Well, I went to a wonderful book written by a man named Howard Ensign Evans. The book's called The Natural History of the Long Expedition to the Rocky Mountains. And Evans gave us the answer. Those grasshoppers were actually an animal that is extinct now, Rocky Mountain locusts. They were extinct and have not been seen since 1902. Edwin James. After about 5 p.m, we began to descend, and a little before sunset arrived at the commencement of the timber, but soon we perceived we had missed our way. It was now become so dark as to render an attempt to proceed extremely hazardous. And as our only alternative, we kindled a fire and laid ourselves down in only our clothes on the first spot of level ground we could find. And they slept, by the way, quite well. After dawn, a dense column of smoke guides the men to the same campsite in which they camped 2 nights before. You remember the fire they had there? Well, their unattended campfire had burned grass, trees, and scorched most of the provisions, blankets, and clothing that they left suspended in the tree. They arrived a little after noon on July 15 at the boiling spring, and it's what James called highly aerated and exhilarating waters of the boiling springs. And soon they were sharing roast venison with the men tending the horse camp. And back at Long's encampment that night, where the mountaineers arrived, they were just on time, based on Major Long's time. They were just on time for the excursion to leave the next morning early. Major Long, however, was, I think, pleased to receive all of James' geographic information about the courses of both the Arkansas and the Platte, to what degree he could provide. And on his map, the map that he was working on throughout the whole journey, on his map, Long marked Pikes High Peak, as Pike called it, as James Peak. And hence the name, for a while, it was James Peak before it became Pikes Peak again. Looking back on this mountain experience, Edwin James journaled a day or two later. This morning, we turned our backs upon the mountains and began to move down the Arkansas. It is not without a feeling of regret that we found our long contemplated visit to these grand and interesting objects was now at an end. And so it was. But our program is not now at an end, except that I'm going to ask you to take a short break. If you want to, take a quick break, take a drink. While I get ready to share partially in the narration of the story of the first woman ever known to reach the top of Pikes Peak. Okay, and okay. So what I'm going to be playing for you in a short while is actually a recording that I was involved in, along with a wonderful voice artist named Nancy Harris. And you'll hear what a wonderful job she does in representing Julia Archibald Holmes. There's one little glitch at the beginning that cuts off just a few words when I'm introducing her, but other than that, I hope you'll be able to hear it and imagine what you're seeing in her trip, her journey to the peak, to the base of the peak, and also to the top of the peak. Let's see. Oh, I have a couple of advisories for you. In one of the letters that Julia wrote that we are excerpting from, Julia uses the word squaw. That is not or should not be part of our lexicon today, as you probably know. But in Julia's time, it was not so. And as you'll see, she was an incredible feminist. And I think today there would be no reason for her to use the word squaw. But at any rate, just to warn you. Now, let me get you some background on Julia Anna Archibald Holmes. Let's subtract the Holmes for just a moment. She and her family lived when she was 16 years old in Worcester, Massachusetts. And that's one of the reasons that she's one of my heroes, or sheroes, whichever you like, because I was born and raised in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I never learned her story until I came to Colorado. But Julia, when she was 16 with her family, with her 7 brothers and sisters, were headed west. It was 1854. And Kansas had just become a territory. And it had not been decided if Kansas territory was to be a slave territory or a free territory. In other words, not allowing slaves. And many people from New England, including the Archibalds, came west. They came west to settle in Kansas. They came west to settle in Nebraska too, because Nebraska and Kansas were brought in as territories at the same time with the same piece of legislation. Well, they got on a train in Boston and headed west. They sang a song that had been newly written to them called the Kansas Emigrants Song, and it had been written by the famous poet and abolitionist John Greenleaf Whitaker. So they sang that song pretty much all the way. I'm sure the other people on the trains might have gotten tired of it. But soon they arrived and helped us settle a place you've probably heard of. Today it's called Lawrence, Kansas. Then it was called Mount Oriad, Kansas. And it was an abolitionist hotbed. It was a place where escaping slaves on the South could find some rescue. And it was a place that was a target for what were called the border ruffians, those slave owners or slave proponents who came across the border into Kansas and did battle with the 2 militias, their militia and the Free State Militia, as they called it. And the Free State Militia at one time was led by a man by the name of John Brown, whose name is familiar to you, I'm sure, and his body still lies moldering in the grave. But after John Brown left, a young man by the name of James Holmes, an abolitionist from New York, took over. And so it was that James met Julia, and Julia and James fell in love. And as things began to settle down along the border there in Kansas, James and Julia decided, well, I decide that I'm going to start telling this story with Nancy Harris, and I hope you enjoy it. Please hit the right button. Bumper music.
Woman on the Santa Fe Trail, a trailblazing female in a male-dominated era, and a fighter for individual freedoms and women's rights. She came to such credentials quite honestly. Her parents and 7 sisters and brothers arrived in Kansas Territory from Massachusetts in 1854 with the avowed intention of making Kansas a free state. They were founders of Lawrence, Kansas. Their home became a meeting place for those who desired to abolish slavery and a station on the Underground Railway for escaping slaves from the South. Julia's mother, Jane, was a strong believer in women's rights and a personal friend of Susan B. Anthony, the suffrage movement leader. Julia held views on the subject of freedom as strong as those of her mother and father. In 1857, at the age of 19, Julia married James Holmes, a bold fighter in the battle against slavery. The young couple settled into his homestead near Emporia, but the adventurous pair did not stay long enough to let the prairie grass grow under their feet. For, as Julia wrote later,
we were on our farm on the Neosho River when news reached us that a company was fitting out in Lawrence for a gold adventure to Pikes Peak. Animated more by a desire to cross the plains and behold the great mountain chain of North America than by any expectation of realizing the floating gold stories, we hastily laid in a supply of provisions in the covered wagon, and 2 days thereafter, the 2nd of June, 1858, were on the road to join the Lawrence Company.
with Julia in the ox-drawn wagon rode her husband and her 18-year-old brother Albert. Upon joining the Lawrence party, Julia found herself to be a center of attention and some controversy.
Nearly all the men were entire strangers to me, and as I was cooking our dinner, some of them crowded around our wagon, gazing sometimes at the stove, which with its smoke pipe looked quite out of place, but oftener on my dress, which did not surprise me, for, I presume, some of them had never seen such a costume before. I wore a calico dress reaching a little below the knee, pants of the same material, Indian moccasins on my feet, and on my head a hat. However much it lacked in taste, I found it to be beyond value in comfort and convenience, as it gave me freedom to roam at pleasure in search of flowers and other curiosities, while the cattle continued their slow and measured pace. I was much pleased to learn upon my arrival that the company contained a lady, and rejoiced at the prospect of having a female companion on such a long journey. But my hopes were disappointed. I soon found that there could be no congeniality between us. She proved to be a woman unable to appreciate freedom or reform, affected that her sphere denied her the liberty to rove at pleasure, and confined herself to long days of feminine impotence in the hot covered wagon. After we had become somewhat acquainted, she in great kindness gave me her advice. "If you have a long dress with you, do put it on for the rest of the trip. The men talk so much about you." "What do they say?" I inquired. "Oh, nothing, only you look so queer with that dress on." "I cannot afford to dress to please their taste," I replied. "I could not positively enjoy a moment's happiness with long skirts on to confine me to the wagon." I then endeavored to explain to her the many advantages which the reform dress possesses over the fashionable long one, but failed to make her appreciate my views. I rejoiced that I was independent of such little views of propriety, and felt that I possessed an ownership in all that was good and beautiful in nature, and an interest in any curiosities we might find on the journey, as much as if I had been one of the favored lords of creation.
And so the slow journey of 500 miles in 5 weeks began. Julia soon came to know the buffalo, the grand emperor of the plain, she called it, the howling of prairie wolves at night around their circled wagons, and the simple pleasure and freedom of walking.
I commenced the journey with a firm determination to learn to walk. At first, I could not walk over 3 or 4 miles without feeling quite weary, but by persevering and walking as far as I could every day, my capacity increased gradually, and in the course of a few weeks, I could walk 10 miles in the most sultry weather without becoming exhausted. I think that when it is in our power, we should, in order to promote our own independence at least, be willing to share the hardships which commonly fall to the lot of men. Accordingly, I signified to the guardmaster that I desired to take my turn with the others in the duty of guarding the camp, and requested to have my watch assigned with my husband. The captain of the guard, who prided himself upon his chivalry, was of the opinion that it would be a disgrace to the gentlemen of the company for them to permit a woman to stand on guard.
As the Lawrence party moved across the Great Plains, they encountered large herds of bison and the Cheyenne and Arapaho people who lived among them. Their encounters with these American Indians were quite friendly, perhaps a little too friendly for James and Julia.
We passed on the 14th of June a large number of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. 50 men armed with Sharps rifles and revolvers were afraid to allow the Indians to know that the company contained any women, in consequence of something which the carriers of the Santa Fe mail told them when they passed a few days previous. I was therefore confined to the wagon while we passed many places of interest which I wished very much to visit. Notwithstanding this care to be unobserved, my presence became known. At one time by opening the front of the wagon for ventilation, at another by leaping from it to see something curious which 2 or 3 Indians had brought, not knowing that we were very near a village. I soon discovered my mistake, and though I did not feel myself that there was any cause for alarm, I was sorry I had been seen on account of the feeling existing in the train. My husband received several flattering offers for me. One Cheyenne wanted to trade 2 squaws for me. Others, not quite so timid, approaching the wagon, made signs for me to jump behind them on their ponies. But I declined the honor in the most respectful language I knew of their dialect, a decided shake of the head. The Arkansas River is very beautiful. Dotted as it is with many little islands, the banks in all cases adorned with flowers, and in many places lined with trees and shrubs. But the current is so swift that it is very unpleasant bathing, that delightful and grateful recreation of the dusty traveler.
In the years following the abandonment of Bent's old fort in 1849, Santa Fe Trail merchant William Bent constructed another trading post at Big Timbers near the present Lamar, Colorado. Not surprisingly, today we call the post Bent's New Fort. The Lawrence party arrived there in late June.
On the 28th, we reached Bent's Fort, a large stone structure built by Mr. Bent for the purpose of trading for robes with the Prairie Indians, and the Cheyenne in particular. The price paid for a buffalo robe at present is 10 cups of sugar, about 8 pounds. Many of the men were so enthusiastic in their admiration of the fort that they took the liberty of getting very drunk by way of compliment to it and the very gentlemanly man who did the honors of the house in Mr. Bent's absence. After tarrying an hour or so, the merry men continued their journey, but went only 3 miles further that day. Up to this time, our company had been remarkably healthy. This afternoon, however, several were taken very ill. After leaving Bent's Fort, we began to look anxiously for a glimpse of Pikes Peak. On the evening of July 3rd, after camping, a sudden rain and hailstorm came upon us, penetrating more or less every wagon cover and blowing down most tents. The next morning, we bid farewell to the Arkansas River, whose company we had kept 300 miles, proceeding up the Fountain River. This day, the glorious 4th, we obtained the first view of the summit of the peak, now some 70 miles away. As all expected to find precious treasure near this wonderful peak, it is not strange that our eyes were often strained by gazing on it. The summit appeared majestic in the distance, crowned with glistening white.
Oh boy.
We arrived on July 8th, as near as wagons could approach the mountains. From this time until the 10th of August, with the exception of 2 days, the train remained encamped in this locality.
From their camp near the Garden of the Gods, parties of men ventured out seeking gold and hunting game. They had little success. But on July 9, 3 men of the party, Voorhees, Cobb, and Miller, set out to climb Pikes Peak. They successfully reached the summit the next day. The climbers added their stones to the small pile accumulated from the time of the peak's first recorded ascent in 1820. Julia and James kept their eyes on the summit as well. With J.C. Miller as their guide, they also began a summit attempt.
August 1st, 1858. After an early breakfast this morning, my husband and I adjusted our packs on our backs and started for the ascent of Pikes Peak. My own pack weighed 17 pounds, 9 of which were bread, the remainder a quilt and clothing. James' pack weighed 35 pounds, 10 pounds bread, 1 pound hog meat, 3/4 pound coffee, 1 pound sugar, a tin plate, knife and fork, half-gallon canteen, half-gallon tin pail, and a 10-pint cup, 5 quilts, clothing, and a volume of Emerson's essays and writing material made up the remainder. We calculate on this amount of food to subsist 6 days.
Although well conditioned from several hundred miles of plains walking, Julia found the stream crossings and steep trailless climbing difficult and challenging, but in camp, there was time for reflection.
It is now 10 o'clock in the evening, and I am reclining before some blazing pine logs beside a torrent in a mountain canyon several hundred feet deep. The straight, slender, tapering pines that stand around so beautiful in their death, smooth, white, and sound, having been stripped of their bark by fire, calmly point to a sky more serene and to stars far brighter than usual. The trees in the sky almost seem to strive together in preserving a deeper silence. But there's music in the foaming stream. Sounds from a dozen little cascades near and far blend together. A thundering sound, a rushing sound, a rippling sound, and tinkling sounds there are, and 1,000 shades of sound fill up between them. The burning pine crackles and snaps, showering sparks, cinders, and even coals around and all over the sheet I'm writing on, as if to mock the tame thoughts they light me to write.
On August 5, Julia and James, carrying nothing but writing materials and Emerson's essays, ascended from their camp near Timberline to the top of the 14,110-foot peak. In cold, blustery weather on the summit, Julia wrote, using a flat rock for her writing desk.
I've accomplished the task which I marked out for myself, and now I feel amply repaid for all my toil and fatigue. Nearly everyone tried to discourage me from attempting it, but I believed that I should succeed, and now here I am, and I feel I would not have missed this glorious sight for anything at all. In all probability, I'm the first woman who has ever stood upon the summit of this mountain and gazed upon this wondrous scene. How I sigh for the poet's power of description, so that I might give you some faint idea of the grandeur and beauty of this scene. Extending as far as the eye can reach lie the great level plains, stretched out in all their green beauty, while the winding of the great Arkansas is visible for many miles. Then the rugged rocks all around, and the almost endless succession of mountains and rocks below, the broad blue sky over our heads, and seemingly so very near. All and everything on which the eye can rest fills the mind with infinitude and sends the soul to God.
Julia Holmes was the first woman known to have gazed at the magnificent view from the top of Pikes Peak. Although American Indians were probably at the summit before anyone else, they left no record of their achievements. To Julia Holmes goes the honor of a first ascent recorded on Pikes Peak and the honor of being the first woman known to climb any of Colorado's 54 14,000-foot peaks. To all of us who traveled the trails of Colorado's fiercely beautiful plains and mountains goes the honor of following in the pioneering footsteps of Julia Archibald Holmes.
Great, I hope you enjoyed that. It was fun for me to listen to it, although, I wrote the script, but to listen to it after many, many times listening before. I think it's very appropriate to say that on today's date, this fact ferreted out for me, thankfully, by one of our board members, Missy Ballard. And on today's date, in 1893, Catherine Lee Bates went to the top of Pikes Peak and doing what Julia begged for or wanted, the poet's power to handle a pen. I think she was an absolutely wonderful writer for a young person, very skilled, as was Edwin James. But of course, we know the poet who got to the top of Pikes Peak. Just a little background on Catherine Lee Bates. She was from Massachusetts. She was a university professor, and for the first summer school at Colorado College in 1893, she came west. And she came west, passed through Chicago when the exposition was going on in Chicago, and then to Colorado, and then to teach for the summer at Colorado College, and also to take a trip actually on a train on the Midland Railroad up Ute Pass, got off undoubtedly in, I guess, whichever station it was, probably not Green Mountain Falls, Cascade, probably Cascade, and then began her ascent on horseback with a number of a few of the other professors who were with her there that summer. So they made it to the top, as you well know. And it was interesting that one of the professors climbed down from his horse and immediately passed out from altitude sickness. However, fortunately for us, Catherine Lee Bates, like Julia Archibald Holmes, did not pass out and had a chance to look around. I hope you had a chance to, at least imaginatively and through your hearing, to hear some of the observations that Edwin James made, and also some of the ones from the top that Julia had made. It's just, there's such an infinity over, what is that, 58 years? 38 years difference. But there's a real infinity to their experiences. And that's why I like to put these together. So Catherine Lee Bates, oh yes. So the story goes, I'm not sure if this is true, the story goes that she climbed down from her horse and looked all around off the top of the peak. And if you've been up there, you know that just as James said, their views are from every direction. And that she gasped, or at least said to herself, "Oh, beautiful." And looking up, such spacious skies. Well, that was an idea that helped to sew together some of the experiences and the images that she'd been collecting all the way on her journey west, out from Massachusetts. And when she got back down to the bottom of the hill, back to the, I believe it was the Antlers Hotel where they were staying, the first Antlers Hotel, she put pen to paper and she created that poem, which when set to music, of course, has become like our second national anthem, America the Beautiful. And I think it was totally great that Misi found out that today was the day that Catherine Lee Bates was at the top of the mountain, and that we could get together, all of us here virtually, and celebrate these two people and the others. Let's not forget the others. Let's not forget James Holmes, who went with Julia, and the other two gentlemen who actually were, well, let's see, one was one of the support staff and one was a soldier, that were willing to go all the way to the top of the mountain with Edwin James. Let's remember them. Let's remember them too. Now, I think we are just about ready for any questions, if any questions have come. And I'll turn it over to Kristen to fire some questions at me, and then I'll try and give you an answer if I can. But most of all, I want to thank, again, Kristen, and I want to thank, excuse me, and I want to thank Allison. No, that's not her. You can see Allison there beside me. This is Julia. Oh, I forgot that part about Julia. Hang on, I think we've got time. It's just after 8 o'clock. When Julia was older, she and James divorced, which is very unusual, of course, in the 1870s. But that was what they did have children, and actually I didn't mention that Julia's brother Albert had gone with her and James on the wagon train, and that he was one of the founders of Trinidad, Colorado. So at any rate, so much for little niblets of historical fact. But here's a few niblets I think are very understandable when you hear Julia Archibald Holmes. She ended up in Washington, D.C., lived out there the rest of her life. And she, after the Civil War, she became an employee of the education department of the US government as a translator. but eventually she became a full-term employee in the education department. And at that, she became, again, pioneer always. She became the very first woman to ever work for full-time for the US government anywhere, as far as I know. So at any rate, remarkable. And I think I'm missing one thing. I'm missing this, the little book from which all the images that I've just shown to you in Julie as part of the program. This little book written and put together, actually edited by Agnes Wright Spring for the Denver Public Library Western History Department in 1949. And it's a wonderful book because it has all of her excellent letters and a few other things that helped us patch together the story of her life. And that I want to give credit to because it's from them that I have received the permission to use the few illustrations that I've shared with you in the Julia part of it. Well, it was from the Denver Public Library Western History Department that I also received many of, not all, but some of the images that I used also to talk about Edwin James. But that's another story, and that's another book. And last but not least, and before I get to your questions, I want to just hold up this. See if you can, the reflection is bad, but I'll hold it up as clear as I can. It's a CD that you just heard part of. You heard about 1/4 of it, called Listening for the Sound of Wheels, that I had a chance a number of years ago to put together the whole thing with some other really great storytellers and musicians and Western historians. It's not available. It was put together for the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail Scenic and Historic Byway, but they stopped buying it. They stopped producing it, and I was able to buy up all the extra copies that were there. So at any rate, you can't get it from them down in Trinidad in their office or whatever. But I'm glad I had a chance to share the exploits of Julia Archibald Holmes and share those with you. I don't get a chance to share that story with the sound effects and everything very often. So thank you for listening in. Now, Kristen, take it away.
Yes, a few closing comments. We have one question in the chat, so you still have time to get your questions out for John to answer. I want to thank you, John, for the presentation, and also thank you to the audience for joining our trip back in time and up to the heights of Tava, Pikes Peak, America's beautiful mountain. Pikes Peak sits at the heart of the land that Wild Connections has been fighting to protect for 25 years. You may hold Colorado's wildlands near to your heart as well. You can make a difference, and we invite your support. Any donation to Wild Connections is greatly appreciated and will be used to ensure that future generations can enjoy wildlife and natural wonders in our region. You can find out more at wildconnections.org or donate at coloradogives.org/wildconnections. And we thank you again for your participation. And now I'll move on to the question that we have from Sherry. The question, John, is, was Julia's trip near John C. Fremont's time?
I used one picture from John's, picture that I showed sort of in between the two programs of Pikes Peak at a distance. And that was from an illustrator that was along with Fremont when he came this way in 1842. So yes, that's the amount of information that I have. I'm not a Fremont expert by any means, and so I really can't say anything more about that expedition. But I do know that that's where I found that photo, that illustration that really helped to fill in the Edwin James segment and help us transmit over to Julia's segment.
Okay, we have a couple more questions coming in. From Allison, when did the Pike expedition happen? Was one question. Let's take them one at a time.
Okay. That was 1806. They came up the Arkansas instead of going down the Arkansas as the long expedition did. One half of the long expedition did. The rest of them went out looking for the Red River and never found it. Another reason why a lot of people are critical of Long as a leader, but things were difficult. So the Long expedition went down in the Arkansas and the Canadian River to the Mississippi, where they met up again. And Zebulon Pike, I believe, yes, he came up the Arkansas and he visited in, I think some of his men, or he and his men got up into South Park. And so that much of the, explored that much of the headwaters of the Platte, but they went also, I think, a good bit ways up the Arkansas. They actually traveled along the Arkansas or up from the Arkansas to get all the way to where Pike Stockade was in the area of Salida. Well, there was a stockade built right near Canyon City, but another one, and then there was another, they built another stockade because they had to overwinter down in the Arkansas, in the Alamosa area. Yeah, Alamosa area in the San Jose, the San Jose, you know what I'm talking about. I always have to apologize at the end. I run out of words, but I'll do my best. I'll slow down and do my best. But the reason that Pike didn't return the way he came is that they got captured by the Spaniards, which some people say was intentional, and they got trotted off down to Mexico, and they returned by a very different route back to Washington, D.C., or I think back to Washington, D.C. So hopefully that answered that question with some roundabouts.
Let's see. More questions. Did Pike climb any peaks?
Something that I had to leave out in the interest of time, when Edwin James was talking about looking down to the south on a peak that perhaps was the one that Pike had climbed, he was referring to the next peak south and the highest south of Pikes Peak, which is Mount Almagre, the one that has a little bit of above timberline on it. And it's a beautiful mountain in itself. But there's been a lot of research that's gone in on that. There was a quote I wanted to read you from Phil Carson, who's a real expert on Edwin James and the first ascension of Pikes Peak. But he and some other people have really worked out done a lot of research and worked out the fact that it was probably Mount Rosa that Pike climbed, where he spent a night and so forth, and climbed up Mount Rosa, which would have put him about, I don't remember the amount, probably 17, 18, 20 miles away from the top of Pikes Peak.
Okay. Let's see, other questions. When did the name Pikes Peak become official?
You know, I think it was something that became more by use than by legislation. But it really was vastly used by the time that, when in 1858, when the Lawrence Party came west with Julia and James, it was called Pikes Peak. even though that map that Long created, which was used substantial for a good number of years after his expedition, and it called it James Peak, that information had sort of dropped by the wayside. There were other maps that were more accurate after the Long map. And so the use of the name James Peak became Pikes Peak by sort of popular choice.
Thank you to the audience for joining our trip back in time and up to the heights of Tava, Pikes Peak, America's beautiful mountain. Pikes Peak sits at the heart of the land that Wild Connections has been fighting to protect for 25 years. You may hold Colorado's wildlands near to your heart as well. You can make a difference, and we invite your support. Any donation to Wild Connections is greatly appreciated and will be used to ensure that future generations can enjoy wildlife and natural wonders in our region. You can find out more at wildconnections.org or donate at coloradogives.org/wildconnection.